We are very fortunate to have with us tonight two esteemed colleagues who will share with us the outcome of the UN Summit to address large movements of refugees and migrants, or the New York Declaration. Kindly turn your attention to the screen as we welcome live from New York the Senior Advisor to the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Migration, Co-Director of International Migration, Columbia University Global Policy Initiative, and Senior European Fellow of Migration Policy Institute, MrGregoryManiatis.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for allowing me to join you virtually, and I cannot see you, but I presume that you can see me. Thank you, Quezon City, for organizing this event, and to Colleen Tuas and the other organizers for having allowed me to join via video. Peter Sutherland, the UN Special Representative for Migration, would have loved to have been there with you. He would have loved to have even participated by video, but he unfortunately is not able to because he is not well enough to travel. But he takes the issue of the role of cities very seriously. He pioneered bringing cities into the highest level conversations in the United Nations back in 2013 with the high-level dialogue on migration. So Peter is there in spirit, and I'm there via video. So I was asked to discuss the outcomes of last week's summits in New York at the United Nations. And I would start by making the point that it was the most important moment in the history of the United Nations when it comes to migration. It was that moment where the greatest number of heads of state gathered and the greatest number of headlines were generated on the issue of migration. There were two distinct summits, related but separate. One was held Monday of last week, and it was the UN Summit on Refugees and Migrants, and the second was held on Tuesday, September 20th, and that was convened by the United States and focused only on refugees, and it had a more operational focus. It's worth thinking about what led to the summits last week. And the proximate cause was the crisis in the Mediterranean, which was a manageable humanitarian crisis that turned into a political crisis and spiraled out of control, led eventually to Brexit in the European Union, at least embedded Brexit, and also has put in some significant degree the international refugee system into some jeopardy. By way of example, the failure of the European Union and the international community to address the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean led to Kenya saying that it was going to close Dadaab, and others who have borne a very severe burden on the refugee issue to also at least ask for more help than they've been getting, and also threaten, in some cases, to not abide by the convention. Peter was the most vocal champion of action at the international level. He advocated for the UN Summit and the US Summit. And the initial idea was that those summits would address both the immediate crisis and come up with a comprehensive plan of action for the Mediterranean and Syrian refugee crisis. But also that comprehensive plan would serve as a model for future crises and for responsibility sharing on refugees. It didn't work out that way. One positive development was that in trying to bring refugees to the international debate, there was quite a lot of pushback from many member states that thought that migration was a more important issue, for them at least, than refugee issues. And so we ended up quite positively with a summit that was about both refugees and migrants. But if you measure the summits against the original intent, which was to try to generate enough support for the immediate crises in the world, it did not go very far. The UN summit did produce what is called the New York Declaration, a 22-page document with a long list of notional commitments by member states on both refugee and migration issues. The Obama summit did produce a $4.5 billion increase in humanitarian aid over the 2015 numbers. It did produce a significant increase in the number of resettlement offers by member states for refugees, but those were one-time offers that apply in 2016 for the most part and are not systemically sustainable. So at the end of the summit last week, you could say that when it comes to the refugee summits, the refugee system, it is in some ways very much on life support. It was built since 1951 primarily through legal precedents that have expanded the legal definition of a refugee and that have created asylum systems in many more countries than we had in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s, which is a good thing. But the political support for the refugee system is now threadbare, and it needs to be rebuilt. And that is a process that hopefully will begin with last week's summit and continue over the next year or two while states negotiate a comprehensive framework on refugee issues and responsibility sharing, which was the most significant outcome of last week's summit when it comes to refugees. On migration, I think we can look back at last week as a more positive story. In fact, migration at the international level has experienced a series of high watermarks over the past decade. At the start of that decade, migration was not a very popular topic at the United Nations. It certainly wasn't dealt with in a productive way. It was principally mired down by political battles. But since 2006, we have seen the creation of the Global Forum on Migration and Development. We've seen the adoption of the Domestic Workers Convention. The UN has held 2 high-level dialogues on migration. And last year, we saw the incorporation of migration and refugee issues into the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. Last week's summit also produced, on the migration side, 2 new milestones. One is a commitment to negotiate a global compact on migration, and the other is to adopt that global compact at an international conference in 2018. Both of those are politically significant. Whether they are meaningful for migrants and for the communities on the ground that they come from and that host them remains to be seen. My own view is that the global compact on migration can be very little. It could end up being just a re-articulation of commitments that have already been made in recent years, including last year and this year, or it could go well beyond that to create a roadmap for the implementation of the commitments that have been made in the 2030 Agenda, in the New York Declaration last week. And that challenge of determining whether the Global Compact will just be a repackaging of existing promises or a roadmap for implementing those promises, I think, is the challenge that we all have to take on over the next 2 years. I think the other very significant development last week was that those who gathered in New York did so in a context of realizing that the actors who matter on refugee and migration issues has expanded. No longer are we looking just at states to solve these problems, but international organizations which haven't been so involved, and other stakeholders really did have a very prominent place on the stage last week. Just to give you a couple of examples, the World Bank, which has had very little involvement in refugee issues, and the European Investment Bank announced the creation of 2 new industrial zones in Ethiopia to try to create jobs in a country that has produced a lot of migrants and refugees over the years, and that hosts refugees. And there has also been similar work done over the past year in Jordan, and I could give many other examples. So you see new international institutions that have very little involvement on this issue. I know Dilip Ratha is joining me, so Dilip has been the main standard bearer of migration in the World Bank, and that has been very admirable for the past 15 years. But it's good to see others of the World Bank seizing this issue. And we also saw the rising importance of non-state actors and non-international organization actors, above all cities. Cities were fairly well represented last week. The private sector was very well represented last week. And the stories of individuals who've made a very big difference, individuals and NGOs over the past year in the refugee crisis, was very prominent last week. For instance, I like to cite a number that really is startling to me, that 50,000 individuals made their way on their own with their own means to the Greek island of Lesbos to assist in the peak of the crisis last year. So I think that is a very hopeful sign that others at the sub-state level are taking full responsibility. You all there are really at the heart of that response. The cities represented in Quezon City, the cities that have been represented at the mayoral forums that have taken place so far, know all of this, know all of the challenges. They know that at the national level, policy is blocked or going backwards. And the reason for that is that national level politicians are preoccupied by issues of security, they're preoccupied by issues of economic and cultural, economic security and cultural identity. And for them, those are make or break issues when it comes to the next election. Unfortunately, city level politicians don't have the luxury of simply focusing on the next election. You have to focus on what's happening today and tomorrow in your cities. And while we've had some exceptions at the national level, I think Germany has admirably embarked on a real whole-of-society approach to integrating the million or so asylum seekers that it's received over the past year and a half. For the most part, the load is carried by all of you. So if we can't reform at the national and the international level as well and quickly enough as we need to, we're going to have to rely on city leaders. So I would just close my remarks with 3 points. I know that you have talked a lot about what it is that cities do when it comes to refugees and migrants. What are the burdens that you have to address in terms of healthcare and education, housing, transportation? All of these challenges that you face are ones that I'm sure populate your conversations these days in Quezon City. But I want to add 3 additional challenges for you, which I think are very important as you have dinner over there. The first is that the cities not only need to take on the challenges that you face every day, but you also need to do something else which is very important, and that is to figure out what the significance of your day-to-day experience, of your policy-making experimentation at the city level. You need to figure out the relevance of all that to the national level, and then you need to determine the best ways to influence and shape national level policy. And not only to influence national level policy so that you have the resources that you need to get done what you need, so not only so that the legal frameworks are put in place, that the budgets are provided for you to do what's needed, but that you can try to create a feedback loop at the national political level and make a negative debate more positive. I think the more we know that cities are doing things that make integration better, the more those stories become part of the national conversation, the less there will be fear amongst publics. And I think that's a really critical challenge that you need to take on. And hopefully there are good models out there for the cities that have done a really good job of creating that feedback loop, of influencing the national debate, and of breaking through what is otherwise a debate dominated by national security issues and economic and cultural security issues. So that's the first challenge. It's really interesting to know the outcomes of your conversations about that. The second challenge is to make sure that you join the international conversations and regional conversations as much as possible. So I gave you the example of mayors who have been present at the high-level dialogue at the UN and at the summits last week. There are many regional fora which don't naturally, typically invite mayors, but you should make the case that when there are national delegations to regional fora, to interregional fora, that mayors should be represented. And again, it's not only because you're trying to influence policy at the international and regional level that will make your lives easier, but it's also because you will change potentially the tone and the tenor of the debates that take place in those forums. So that's the second point. And the third point is that mayors are also subject to the same electoral forces that national level politicians are. And that as you do all this work, it's, I think, critically important to build the capacity that will outlive the current administration in your cities. So focusing on the training of personnel, civil servants, focusing on making sure that civil society is robust enough, generating the resources to do all that is vital, so that there is sustained leadership well past the current tenure of whatever current administration there is, and that can carry on the leadership that you have shown for the next generation. Thank you very much.